What is the most out-of-touch thing you have ever heard, and how did you respond to it? Story 1. A friend worked at the Better Business Bureau. After COVID, the management of her office sent everyone a survey, asking everyone if they'd like the option to continue working from home. The management then sent a message saying the results of the survey were in, and that 90% of employees said they wanted to keep working from home. The management then sent an announcement that no one could work from home for any reason. They didn't mention why. The head manager of their office then sent everyone a farewell notice that she was moving across the country to be closer to her relatives, but not to worry because she'd be able to remain their manager by working from home full-time. Story 2. I work in a pet store with a grooming salon. Our groomer committed suicide and it was fucking awful. Awful, awful, awful. We had to ring all her bookings and cancel them and tell clients that she died. Awful, awful, awful. One day, a woman came in and asked if she could leave some flyers for her counseling services. I politely took them with the intention of discreetly binning them. She then proceeded to ask if she could book her dog in for a groom, and I had to tell her that she couldn't as the groomer had passed away. She responded, "Well, that's awfully inconvenient for me." I pulled the bin out from under the register and slid her flyers straight into the bin while staring her down. I had no words, just stabby eyes. Story 3. Someone I shared a house with in college, who was either not yet or barely 21, complained about her peer not being educated in wine, that there is no excuse. I asked her what she was up to once. She was flipping through Vogue and she answered, shopping, so I guess she was rich. Story 4. Many years ago, I was living in Philadelphia. I had a very nice colleague at the office, a young woman from a very privileged family. She'd lived all her life downtown, at least when she wasn't summering in Bar Harbor or spending weekends at their place in Bryn Mawr. One weekend, we were going to meet for lunch. We spoke on the phone and I said I'd see her soon. I was out in West Philadelphia, so I grabbed the subway and got off a block from her apartment. "You got here so quickly!" Yes, I took the subway. Now don't tease me, there's no subway here, we're not in New York. I had to walk her over one block, show her the stop, and even go down to the ticket level at the subway one block from the place she'd lived for 30 years. I probably could have just told her I'd teleported. Story 5. I once wanted to gift a friend a gig ticket. She was a young mom at the time and she didn't have any spare cash to spend on herself or to go out and do anything fun. She was very hesitant to take it and it was 100% my idea. My other friend who was in her 30s at the time, "I think she's manipulating you. I just don't believe she can't afford a ticket. I mean, there's always money." This woman had never lived away from her parents and was from a relatively wealthy background. She also said, people who haven't got money really only have themselves to blame for not managing their finances better. Had to have a chat with her about how not everyone comes from the same background, and some people go to bed hungry daily. Story 6. At an old job, I had a breakdown because I had not been paid in 6 weeks, and literally was unable to eat, and was walking to work because I could not afford gas. Boss found me crying and told me I was being petty for wanting my money, and asked me, "Why don't you just live off of your savings?" I was a 21-year-old recent college grad who wasn't getting my paychecks. What savings? Story 7. My coworker, fresh out of school, was really confused why so many people took public transportation to commute into the city. Turns out her parents paid for a personal driver for her, and that's how she got to work and back. Not an Uber, a car service. She had no idea what it cost. Probably never thought about it. Just figured everyone else preferred the subway bus to having a personal driver. Story 8. My in-law grandparents when we were negotiating to buy our house. Note, they are retired and her grandfather was a New York lawyer. GP. They are asking $400. Just offer them $200K cash, they'll take it. We informed them we don't have $200K in cash. Story 9. I was in a local sub shop waiting for my order. A guy and his, I assume, girlfriend come in and start reading the menu. The cashier asked what they wanted. Girlfriend. "Yeah, what's a portobello mushroom burger?" Cashier. "Oh, well, a portobello is like an extra large mushroom roughly the size of a burger patty." Girlfriend. "So, portobello means mushroom, and your sign says portobello mushroom burger? That's redundant. I won't eat here." She literally stormed out. The cashier, who I was friendly with, just burst out laughing and said to the guy something along the lines of WTF was that. Boyfriend. "I don't fucking know, man. She gets like this. I just wanted a damn meatball sub." Then proceeds to sigh and walk out with his girlfriend. Story 10. I'm a deaf teacher and college professor with 5 college degrees. I've owned my house for 20 years and my neighbor still lives next door to me. He sees me leaving for work every morning as well as arriving home. I'm dressed work casual, and I always have a work bag along with a lunch container. 20 years of this. He's seen the work I've done to my house, dollar, as well as the vehicles I've purchased over the years, plus supporting a family and 3 dogs. As recently as last month, he says to me, "How is it possible that deaf people like you work?" Story 11. My boss's wife is the child of a millionaire who married an heir to the throne of a multi-million-dollar-a-year organization where I was working for $10 an hour. Her, "You, where are you planning on taking your honeymoon when you get married?" Me, "I don't know, a week on the beach or maybe a quiet cabin in the mountains." Her, "Pff, no one will ever marry you if you refuse to take them to Hawaii for a honeymoon." Story 12. I used to work in a QA lab as a software engineer with 2 teams, each 7 people. At this company, it was heavily encouraged to work through lunch. You'd be docked an hour pay even as a salaried employee if you left. So we did. This was among other insanely overbearing rules. Anyway, one day, investors are visiting to check out our company. Our HR, old rich guy that was recently hired because he was friends with the CEO, is giving him a tour. This happens to be during our lunch. When giving his speech about the lab, in front of all of us, he goes, "While we're out for lunch, sitting down at a restaurant, enjoying our meals, these guys are in here testing 24/7. I was literally in shock. My coworker and I just stared at each other in horror. Story 13. I was visiting my aunt. She and her husband both had very good jobs. She kept her bills pinned to a bulletin board so she would remember to pay them. I says to her, "Auntie, your car payments alone are more than we make in an entire month, and we are supporting 2 kids on it." She looked at me stunned with her mouth open. "How do you kids live?" Story 14. Made a new friend, and he asked if I went on annual holidays as a child. I explained that we could never afford to go abroad, but every few years we would take a trip somewhere within the country. He said he had a similar experience. His family went to Croatia every year, but they could only afford it because they didn't have to worry about paying for accommodation because his parents owned a house over there. I was also shopping for a wheelchair at the time, and struggling to find one I could afford. He said I should get an electric one because it would suit my needs better. I explained that there was no way I could afford it because they were upwards of $1,000. He didn't understand, kept asking me when I was getting an electric wheelchair, and when I said I couldn't afford one, he would just say, "But they are so worth the money." Story 15. The new Prime Minister, a former caretaker CEO who owns 7 homes, including a $5 million beach house, said that a weekly grocery bill for a family is about $60. I guess that might be what your weekly grocery bill is if you eat every meal at a restaurant. One of his MPs said that every now and again he likes to take the shopping list off his wife and go to the supermarket for a reminder of how the everyday people live. Story 16. I was a teacher making $35K before taxes, and one of my students' parents was a stay-at-home wife whose husband made over $1 million a year as an energy company CEO. She came in one afternoon and told me about how stressed she was over renovating their home's 3,000 SF basement, a basement that was 3x as large as my entire home. In my effort to connect with her, I told her I was so sorry and that I was also dealing with some stress, having to replace all the exterior plumbing of my house. I added that I was grateful that my tax return would cover most of it. Her response, "Oh honey, be glad you even get a tax return. We haven't gotten anything back for 20 years. All I could say was, well, that's one way to look at it. Story 17. Had a friend group that lasted about a decade. 2 of us were low income. I was lower middle class, the other was in borderline poverty, and the others came from extremely wealthy families. One day we were talking about income, and I mentioned that anyone who made above 100K was rich in my eyes. And one friend laughed at me and said, "Yeah, but all of us here make over 100K. I had to stop and stare in absolute shock. My family collectively barely made half of that. I realized then how much privilege she had that she was completely unaware of, and just assumed that everyone else had the same luxuries that she did. Story 18. When I was interning at a museum early in my career, my husband and I were house hunting and put an offer on our home. One of the interns I worked with came from a very, very rich family. Think old money oil baron type. He didn't have to work. He just enjoyed learning history and traveling around to different internships for fun. He asked me what steps I needed to take to buy the house, and I mentioned our mortgage paperwork. He sneered and looked at me like I was the dumbest person alive and said, "Don't mess with a mortgage, just buy it outright. It will save you money and interest." Okay, dude. As a 25-year-old supporting myself, I'm just going to pull $400,000 out of my ass. Story 19. I worked as a landscaper for a client who spent $175,000 on our services every year. He was remodeling part of his house for shits and gigs, and it was estimated to cost about $2 million to renovate. He talked to me about how easy young people have it these days because we all have cars, TVs, and cell phones. He was lamenting how no one wants to work anymore, and how young people just expect everything these days. I was happy to get a brief moment to explain to him how the basic necessities, housing, food, healthcare, education, are becoming unattainable for people, especially in large West Coast cities, despite TVs and phones being cheap these days. Story 20. I was working as an architect for a practice with HNWI clients. I was making small talk with one of them, both of us in the mid-30s, him born into one of the richest families in England. I was saying how the flat me and my husband were renting was being sold, so we were looking for another flat to rent. But everything is very expensive. He then said something along the lines of, "I don't understand why you don't buy a house. That way you will not have to pay rent every month and you will have much more space than in a flat." Story 21. A Wall Street Journal podcast I was listening to claimed a study was done that uncovered that Americans didn't want to retire and actually wanted to work longer. Who TF did you interview? Boomer CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. I don't know a single working person who wants to work until they drop. That's just naive at best. Both my parents and my wife's wealthy parents retired as early as made sense and are enjoying the rest of their years. Of course they stay busy, but not working for the company. They work on projects they deserved to work on years before. Whatever lame study was done was clearly a hand-picked control group aimed at creating a false narrative. Story 22. About 20 years ago, my boss sat us all down and talked about an investment that he thought we would be good for us. I don't remember what it was. The thing I remember is him saying, "You can put that spare $100 each week into the investment." Crickets chirping. Meeting ended. Nobody had a spare $100 a week. I was living hand-to-mouth myself and I did the payroll, so I knew what everybody else was earning. Another one back in the late 80s, early 90s boss's wife worked in the office too. She commented one day that a certain shop had lovely blouses that were only $100. Lol. That was a third of my weekly pay. I suspect the comment came because we didn't wear lovely blouses because we could not afford them.